They once told me, in the thin, uneasy hours between the grinding demands of orders and the rare, almost illicit moments of sleep, that a man forged of iron cannot be broken. I believed them. I believed the medals that rested heavily against my chest, each a burnished token of trials survived, of men led and lost. I believed the maps, those ancient sheets inked with the flow of rivers and mountains, soaked in the blood of other men, turning the terrain itself into a ledger of sacrifice. I believed the faces of boys who learned to stand straighter when I spoke, whose eyes widened in fear and respect, and whose very bodies seemed to anticipate my will, trained to die when I pointed, to move as one when I commanded. Belief was power, clean, efficient, absolute. It narrowed the world into a single line of march, compressed reality into the discipline of steps and seconds, and turned the heart into a drum that never missed its beat, a rhythm that demanded obedience from flesh and bone alike. I believed because believing is easier than seeing, because the chaos of life makes clarity precious and certainty intoxicating. The world outside might be a wilderness of chance, but in the regimented universe of belief, every action had meaning, every risk accounted for, and every outcome, no matter how bloody or cruel, justified. I believed, and that belief transformed me. It wrapped itself around my bones like armor. It whispered that I was necessary, inevitable, untouchable by the ordinary limits of men. I could march further than they could, endure longer than they could, command with a voice that resonated across desert sands and frozen plains alike. I believed that the discipline of belief could outlast hunger, cold, artillery fire, and fear itself. But now, in the quiet that has followed the chaos, I speak into a silence so thick it feels like judgment, a silence that stretches over the ruins of battles won and lost, over the echoes of orders once shouted and once obeyed. The war is decaying, rusting at its edges, and men speak of peace as though it were a summons, a civility I must wear and then shed at will. They ask me, the general, the machine, the instrument of power, to step down, to dismount from the saddle of command and descend into ordinary hours. They do not understand that my voice was not born in one lifetime, that it has been forged and reshaped through centuries of conflict, over sands and snow, over rivers and mud, across cities and fields whose names have long since been swallowed by memory. I have marched across deserts where the sun was a blade above my head, its heat searing the skin of those who followed me, and yet leaving me untouched by fatigue, as if the fire itself recognized my purpose. I have shouted over the shriek of artillery, a voice amplified by fear, courage, and necessity, cutting through the chaos to guide men whose very lives depended upon my tone, my cadence, my will. I have stood barefoot on frozen ground where the sky tasted like iron, where frost and blood mingled in the soil beneath my feet, and yet the cold was only a detail, a backdrop to the rhythm of command. These experiences do not simply reside in memory. They fuse, overlap, and converge into a single, intolerant certainty. I am more than the sum of one life, one war, one era. That certainty is both weapon and prison, a sharpened edge that slices decisively through hesitation, but also a chain that binds me to an existence that cannot be unlearned, an identity that cannot be shed. Every sound, every shadow now seems to carry echoes of the past. The whisper of wind through broken branches is a reconnaissance report. The scent of smoke and soil in the air evokes campaigns fought on distant plains and ancient hills. I find myself recalling not only my victories, but the faces of those I commanded, the weight of their trust pressing against the fabric of time, their loyalty both a shield and a shackle. I have loved and feared this certainty, relished and cursed it, and now I sit within it like a king in a palace built entirely of mirrors, reflections of power, reflections of mortality, all converging into a vision I cannot escape. Even as men speak of peace, as though the cessation of gunfire could undo the laws of my existence, I understand that peace is a form of cruelty. It strips away the framework I was built to inhabit. Orders vanish, the march dissolves. The world becomes a blank canvas where my voice carries no authority, and in that silence, The weight of all that I have seen presses against my chest. The boys who learned to die when I pointed, the cities burned, the rivers crossed, the fields left strewn with memory, they speak to me still, through shadows and dreams, reminding me that my certainty has no counterpart in ordinary life. I am more than one man. I have been countless commanders, countless soldiers, countless voices that once declared life and death with precision. Those voices and experiences collide inside me, a chorus that refuses to cease. The past stretches into the present like a battlefield without end. Each memory, each recollection, sharpens my understanding that I was shaped not by chance, but by the compounding weight of my own history, by the unbroken line of battles that have stitched together every fragment of my identity. This realization is exhilarating and terrifying, intoxicating and isolating. It defines me and confines me, gives me command and strips away comfort. The irony is cruel. In believing myself unbreakable, I have forged the chains that now bind me. Belief, once my weapon, has become my cell, and yet even here, even in the silence that stretches across decades and dreams, I cannot relinquish it. It is mine, inseparable from the rhythm of my heart, from the cadence of command that has been written into my very flesh. To question, it is to unmake myself. To abandon, it is to surrender to a world that no longer comprehends what it means to endure, to lead, to carry the weight of countless lives as though they were mine alone. Courage, I learned, is arithmetic. Each act of bravery, each calculated risk, can be measured, accounted for, rationed, and spent without waste. Discipline is currency, a regiment's obedience, a soldier's training, their collective will. These are deposits and withdrawals in the same inexorable account. Fear, too, can be quantified, observed, and manipulated. I learned to weigh it, parcel it out, deploy it precisely, and yet never allow it to overrun the machine I had become. In this ledger, every sensation, every glance, every moment of hesitation had its place, its cost, its balance. And yet beneath that logic, beneath the rigid columns of strategy and calculation, lies an older, far darker ledger, one that counts returns, repeats, reverberations across time. Faces reappear, as though drawn by some inexorable law of history. I have seen them in different uniforms, on different continents, in battles separated by decades or centuries, yet always familiar. The eyes are the same. The expressions carry the same weight of hope and fear, devotion and dread. Voices return in new tongues, names replaced, yet the tone, the cadence, the raw edge of command or desperation, it is all unmistakable. Victories, no matter how decisive, turn to ash in my mouth. I have held the spoils of conquest in my hands, watched flags rise and fall, and yet the taste of triumph evaporates into memory as easily as smoke from a cannon. Every win is a promise to be tested again, every victory a rehearsal for the next, and every loss a reminder that history repeats itself like a drumbeat that no man can silence. I have watched the same sunrise break over the same horizon more times than I can name. In Rome, the morning light fell upon marble and aqueducts, gilding them in a perfection that would soon be shattered by the footfalls of soldiers. In Tripoli, the sun struck the sands, turning dunes into rivers of fire, only to vanish behind smoke from battles already concluded. I have seen it rise over nameless fields, ground scarred with blood and mud, places erased from memory, yet etched indelibly into my own. And in each dawn, I believed I could stand at the edge of mortality itself, gaze down into the abyss, and step over it untouched. That belief, that arrogance, was the true danger. To be believed immortal, to be worshipped, feared, and obeyed as though flesh and bone could not betray you, is to forget the weight of falling, the inevitability of being claimed by the world you seek to command. It is a lesson taught only by time, by war, by the unflinching repetition of consequence. War became more than purpose, it became identity. I learned to love it, I learned to crave it. I loved the geometry of formations, the precision of columns moving as a single organism, responding to the will of one hand as if each man were part of some living machine. I loved the scrape of metal, the way the sound of artillery mingled with the measured steps of infantry, the way cavalry thundered across plains, leaving the earth trembling beneath its hooves. There was music in it, a savage, inevitable, hypnotic rhythm that seduced the mind even as it demanded obedience. I convinced myself it would never end, that the drumbeat I felt within my chest would echo eternally, unbroken, undiminished. Yet night always speaks. In the quietest intervals between reconnaissance missions and the first orders of dawn, between the distant scream of artillery and the whispering of wind through shattered trees, a question began to creep in, insistent, unrelenting. What if immortality is not victory over death, but a sentence to witness the same ending again and again? At first I dismissed it. My mind, forged in the furnace of command, sought to rationalize, to argue, to suppress. Yet the question returned with every battlefield, every sunrise, every face repeated across time. I began to see patterns where once there was only chaos, repetitions that no mortal man could survive unchanged. I have stood in the ruins of cities, their streets littered with the detritus of war, and seen echoes of other wars overlaying them. In Carthage, I have walked beneath columns that were shattered by a distant, ancient hand, and in the smoke of modern battle, I recognized the same cries, the same fear, the same futile courage. I have seen myself leading armies across continents, in centuries separated by impossible distances, yet the weight of responsibility, the certainty of command, has never changed. It has only grown heavier, layered upon layer, until I can no longer tell which life I inhabit, which war is the present, and which is memory. The ledger of returns does not allow mercy. Each soldier I have led, each life entrusted to me, is accounted for again and again, a repeated entry in an unending column. Death, in this ledger, is not final, it is rehearsal. The same mistakes, the same losses, the same small triumphs, all return to me, echoing in patterns so precise they become almost sacred. I see generals of other eras in my reflection, advisors who no longer exist, and I hear the same orders whispered back to me in languages I do not remember learning. The horizon itself seems rehearsed. Every hill, every valley, every river crossing feels inevitable, predestined. I have begun to question not only the purpose of my campaigns, but the purpose of my very existence. Am I immortal? Perhaps, but immortality is no gift. It is a sentence not to live, but to witness, to remember, to carry the weight of endless war across generations. The victories I once cherished now feel hollow. The men I led, no matter their loyalty or courage, are shadows that return to me again and again, to remind me that nothing is ever finished, and still I march. I cannot stop. To pause is to be erased, to rest is to lose command over the machinery of memory and consequence that defines me. I have come to understand the true cost of belief, of power, of command. The ledger is not a record of glory, but of repetition, of cycles that cannot be broken. It measures more than courage, more than discipline. It measures endurance, patience, obsession, the ability to survive through centuries of war without surrendering the mind to madness. And in that endurance, in the rhythm of repeated victory and loss, I have become both conqueror and witness, both participant and chronicler, both machine and man. Night returns, always with the same question, sharpened by the memory of countless dawns. What is the point of victory if it must be witnessed again? What is the point of life if it is not allowed to end? In that silence, I hear the ledger whispering. It is patient, relentless, inexorable. And I write, not to escape, not to explain, but to record, to account, to bear witness to the truth of endless war, the true cost of command, the weight of being more than one life, more than one man. After victory, the world smelled of rot and oil. The scent hung in the air like a reminder that life had moved on without permission, that history did not wait for men to catch their breath. Europe lay sprawled before me like a corpse, twitching with the echoes of death, the whispers of 1,000 lives ended too soon, the creaking of structures on the verge of collapse. The cities were skeletal, their streets hollowed by fire and shell, yet still inhabited by the living, who move through ruins as if walking among ghosts. I rode among the devastation, my metals glinting like false suns in the pale winter light, their polished surfaces reflecting nothing but the emptiness of my own gaze. To an observer, I appeared triumphant, commanding, unbroken. But inside, I felt every stitch of history pressing against me, a weight far heavier than any armor I had worn in battle. My men laughed. They rebuilt, they smoked, they joked about the past as though it were something they could leave behind. They spoke of home, of warm beds and kitchens filled with the smell of bread. I could not join them. Their laughter, their hope, was a language I had forgotten how to speak. Beneath every ruined farmhouse, beneath every shell-scarred street, I glimpsed the bones of older wars. Perhaps wars I had commanded under other names, in other centuries, in other worlds. It was as if history itself refused to release me from its endless cycle, as if every battlefield I had ever known lay buried beneath the rubble of the present. The smoke rising from burned villages carried with it the memory of previous campaigns, and I inhaled it like a soldier taking measure of an old, familiar enemy. Each village liberated, each ridge taken, each river crossed felt rehearsed. Not the rehearsal of memory in the mind, but of the soul. Every action, every triumph, every death had occurred before, layered upon itself like transparent echoes. I could feel the cadence of soldiers marching across centuries, the rhythm of commands given and obeyed, the subtle weight of anticipation in the eyes of men who had followed me before. I began to see patterns in the chaos, repetitions that transcended time. And it terrified me, for if one life could be remembered so vividly by another, what then could death claim, and what could peace offer to a man who had survived so much, who had been present for so many ends? One night, among the wreckage of tanks left smoking in fields still warm from battle, I felt the world shift beneath me. I ran my hand across the steel hull of a destroyed Panzer, and it pulsed, not with life, but with memory. Warm steel, humming faintly with the residue of fury, spoke to me in a language older than names. In that instant, Germany became Carthage. My pistol became a sword. The hills of Lorraine folded into the dunes of North Africa. Forests of Europe melted into the arid plains where I had ridden long before I was born in this life. I knew then, I had been here before, I had killed here, I had died here. The realization was not comforting. It was a curse. That is the true curse, not the endless prolongation of life, but the endless recognition of one's own deeds, the inability to forget the shape of slaughter, the geometry of violence, the delicate precision with which death organizes itself across men and landscapes. Each corpse, each broken building, each fallen horse, each twisted tree became a symbol, a repetition of what I had already witnessed, already caused. The horror is not in the blood, but in the familiarity. To remember every blow, every scream, every futile charge, is to live in a battlefield without end. And still, men called it victory. They called it liberation. They spoke of peace. Peace came, and with it exile. To be a general without a war is to be a relic, an insult to oneself and to the dead who had followed your orders into fire. The engines of my divisions lay cold, their tanks rusting in November rain. Artillery sat silent, like gods abandoned in temples, their iron arms folded in impotent stillness. I wandered among them like a priest among fallen idols, whispering prayers no one would hear, offering rites to machines that could no longer respond. The silence was more oppressive than the roar of any battlefield. It was a silence pregnant with expectation, a silence that demanded meaning where none could exist. Peace, they said, but peace felt like the slowest form of death. It did not heal, it did not cleanse. It forced me to confront the irrelevance of experience, the futility of command without consequence. My body, trained to obey, to endure, to strike, now moved through landscapes emptied of purpose. My metals, once symbols of authority and devotion, gleamed faintly in the gray light, reflections of a past that demanded recognition but offered no sustenance. The officers spoke politely, the generals smiled, the ministers nodded, and in their eyes I saw the faintest trace of dismissal. "You are no longer needed." Their words did not wound me as bullets might, but they struck at something older, something fundamental. To exist only as a memory of oneself is to discover that eternity is not triumph, but irrelevance. And yet I could not escape the echoes. The wind moaned through the shattered buildings like the voice of a soldier long dead. Dogs barked in the distance the same way they had before every assault, before every massacre, before every charge that had cost men their lives. I found myself awake in the cold, tracing my finger along maps that no longer mattered, over landscapes already etched in the scars of countless campaigns. Each line I drew, each contour I studied, was a reminder that war had not ended. It had only changed its form. From battlefields of soil and blood to the internal campaigns of memory and guilt, I realized that my fight continued, that peace was an illusion, a temporary ceasefire in a conflict that would follow me until I ceased to be. I wandered through ruins, through towns that had once teemed with life, now emptied of hope. I smelled the acrid tang of gunpowder, the rot of waterlogged corpses, the iron-tinged sweetness of spilled blood. And as I moved, I became aware of a terrifying truth. The war was not just outside me in the cities and fields, it was inside. Each breath, each heartbeat, each tremor of the hand was a reminder that the ledger of war continued unbroken, unrelenting. There was no respite, no absolution, no sanctuary. I understood then that my life, my memory, my very identity was a battlefield, and peace was merely a pause between engagements, a lull in the eternal rhythm of violence and remembrance. In that pause, I realized what true exile meant. It was not removal from place or people. It was the impossibility of rest, the impossibility of leaving behind the weight of command, of carnage, of consequence. Even among men laughing at trivial jokes or rebuilding homes, I remained detached, watching, remembering, bearing the unshared burden of all I had endured. The war had left its mark not on the land alone, but on me, etched into my bones, my mind, my very soul. And so I moved through victory and peace alike, a shadow among the living, a witness to ruins both ancient and recent, a general without a battlefield, yet burdened with the memory of every one I had ever commanded. The world called it reconstruction, I called it exile. The engines of industry, the machinery of life, pressed on around me, indifferent to my presence, as I wandered among relics of my own creation and destruction. Victory, I learned, is not an end. It is an unrelenting reminder that peace, when it arrives, is the cruelest of punishments for those who have known only the rhythm of war. After victory, after the world had quieted its guns and the rubble had cooled beneath gray skies, I found that the one enemy I could not command was fate itself. I tested it. I pushed beyond reason, beyond caution, beyond the limits that mortals respected. I drove recklessly along roads slick with rain, my tires carving thin scars into the mud, each puddle reflecting the overcast sky like a warning. I stood too close to unexploded shells, each one a slumbering god of iron, my body tasting the possibility of annihilation in its stillness. I let my finger rest on the trigger longer than wisdom allowed, feeling the tension of potential violence coursing through my veins, imagining the quick, decisive end it might bring. Each time, fate flinched. Each time, I survived. Each survival hardened the belief that had settled like a stone in my chest. I was chosen, sculpted by history itself, a conduit of violence and command, immune to the ordinary limits of man. Then came the drive that would blur reality and memory into one fevered vision. The morning was gray and wet, the roads slick with rain, the air tasting like iron and gasoline. Major Van Doren, my aide, sat beside me, pale with exhaustion and the quiet terror that always accompanies those who see greatness and madness entwined. I remember the smell of fuel, the hum of the engine, the vast, empty expanse ahead. And then a whisper inside me, soft yet insistent, said, "Prove it." Without hesitation, I pressed harder on the accelerator. The car leapt forward, devouring the road. The world around me narrowed. collapsing into a tunnel, and in that contraction, time itself folded. I was no longer in a car, no longer confined to the fragile flesh of a single life. I was astride a horse charging across sun-scorched plains, smoke curling from distant battlefields. Around me appeared every army I had ever led. Macedonians with shields polished to a mirrored sheen, Romans marching with impeccable discipline, crusaders shouting prayers, tank crews pressing forward over mud and shell. All were layered upon each other, the ghosts of campaigns past and futures yet to be fought, moving as one with me at the center. Their footsteps, their hoofbeats, the rumble of engines and the clash of steel became a single pulse, a rhythm that made the air itself tremble. Then came the crash, time fractured, space collapsed, and yet I lived. When I opened my eyes, the world had returned to its gray, rain-slicked form. The car, mangled and twisted, sat like a wounded animal in the ditch. Major Van Doren's hand shook as he touched my shoulder. "You should be dead, sir," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the quiet rain, and perhaps I was. I thought, because when I glanced into the rearview mirror, the face staring back was no longer the reflection of a man who had driven recklessly through a morning fog. It was older than flesh, older than time, burning not with life, but with memory. Eyes that had seen centuries of death stared back at me. The skin was pale, marked by battles I could scarcely remember, and yet the weight of each victory and each failure pressed against the frame of my soul. The doctors called it a miracle. They spoke of the body's resilience, of luck, of divine protection. I smiled politely. Their words meant nothing. It was no miracle. It was confirmation. Confirmation that I had bent fate, that I had tested its limits, and that it had yielded to me, even if reluctantly. I had faced death and it had deferred, leaving me intact, untouched by the consequences it reserved for ordinary men. Yet beneath that triumph, something darker stirred, coiling in my chest like a serpent. What does an immortal conqueror do when the world is at peace, when the battles that define him are no longer fought? When there are no enemies to outflank, no fortresses to storm, no orders to issue that carry the weight of life and death? The answer came slowly, and it came in silence. At the manor where I was moved for recovery, surrounded by comforts designed to soothe men who had faced lesser traumas, the ghosts returned. Mirrors, once benign, now treacherous, revealed faces that were mine, yet not mine. Warriors with eyes like embers stared back, kings with crowns of tarnished gold, peasants with the same scar above the brow, each a fragment of a single command, each a reflection of the same ambition, the same fever for control. They multiplied endlessly, a silent army trapped behind glass, awaiting orders they would never receive. The walls of the manor became a labyrinth of memory. I could not rest, I could not sleep. The corridors echoed with whispers of campaigns past, the metallic tang of spent gunpowder, the distant cadence of drums that had once commanded thousands to their deaths. In this haunted stillness, the truth revealed itself in a voice neither accusatory nor forgiving, but quiet, undeniable. "You are not immortal. You are unfinished." The words struck deeper than any bullet, faster than any charge across a battlefield. I had believed that survival alone conferred purpose, that to outlast the centuries was to wield power beyond comprehension. But the voice reminded me that immortality is not merely living through time. It is completion, the fulfillment of a narrative. And I was still a fragment, a soldier whose campaigns were unending in memory, whose body may persist, but whose soul remained in suspended conflict. The realization was a heavier weight than any armor, more suffocating than any winter on the battlefield. I moved through the manor like a man trapped between life and eternity. Mirrors, once avoided, now demanded attention. They reflected not just flesh, but spirit, each glance revealing layers of command and consequence I had sought to forget. Warriors I had once led stared at me silently, their devotion undiminished by the centuries, yet their obedience hollowed by repetition. Kings who had crowned themselves under my orders looked on with the faintest trace of judgment. Each reflection reminded me of the cost of survival, of the endless echo of my deeds. In those hours, I understood the terrible truth of my existence. Immortality is not the absence of death. It is the endless persistence of influence, the unbroken continuation of one's presence in the machinery of history. To command once is to command always, if only through memory. To survive is not to escape, but to bear witness to the infinite repetition of war and its consequences. I could no longer distinguish my victories from the failures, my conquests from the cruelties. They were intertwined, layered atop one another, forming a tapestry I could not set down, a ledger I could not close. And so, at the manor, in the gray and cold, I waited, not for recovery, not for death, but for understanding. I waited for the moment when the weight of command, of survival, of memory, might find an answer. It did not come as a miracle, nor as a revelation, nor as consolation. It came as a quiet acknowledgment I was unfinished. I was still bound to the cadence of wars past and yet to come, to the pulse of armies I had led and would lead again in the minds of those who remembered me. I was not immortal. I was eternal only in unfinished business, in the unbroken cycle of command and recognition. And in that, there was both freedom and doom, a truth I could neither ignore nor escape. At last, I understood the unbearable truth that had lingered at the edges of my awareness, like the shadow of a rifle pointed at my back long before I had realized the danger. Immortality, I realized, was never about the endurance of flesh. The body, no matter how hardened, how tested against the extremes of winter, desert, or battlefield, could not alone define eternity. The true weight of immortality lay in identity, in the unbroken thread of self that marches through time and circumstance, surviving long after the flesh that once bore it has rotted into dust. I had been trapped in the machinery of conquest, a cog forged of ambition, discipline, and the persistent demand of history itself. Every battle I had waged, every campaign I had led, was not merely an event confined to a date on a calendar. It was a rehearsal, a repetition that stretched into infinity. Each life I inhabited was another campaign, each death merely a redeployment to another theater, another horizon, another iteration of the same orchestration of men and metal, blood and earth. The realization came not with the clarity of joy, but with the weight of years stacked upon decades, the cumulative pressure of centuries condensed into a single, shattering thought. I was not eternal. I had never been. I was only remembered. My deeds, my commands, my presence. They lingered in the memory of men and the echo of history, and that memory was a different kind of eternity, colder, sharper, and more relentless than any human life could endure. Men like me, soldiers, generals, commanders forged in the fires of ambition and war would always be born. For as long as war demanded voices to command it, new men would step into my boots, raise banners in my shadow, and swear allegiance to ideals as yet unnamed. I had been one of many, a singular pattern repeated across generations, and the war, eternal in its desire to be fought, had used me as its instrument. The first snow came silently, drifting down from a gray sky, covering the scars of the earth like a benediction. Trenches, once crisscrossing the landscape like veins of death, disappeared beneath its cold mercy. Shell craters, pockmarks of ruin and memory, softened under its weight. And the ghosts, the phantoms of the men I had led, the soldiers who had followed me through desert sands, frozen rivers, and burning villages, stood still, at last rendered inert by a world that had decided to rest. For the first time in decades, perhaps centuries, I felt a lightness I had long forgotten, as if the snow itself had entered my chest and brushed away the rust of command, the ash of victory, and the weight of unending responsibility. I watched young soldiers pass along the roads of a Europe still scarred by the conflicts of old. Their uniforms were new, their faces bright with the illusion I had once worn like armor, the belief that courage confers invincibility, that honor is eternal, that one's will can bend fate itself. I did not warn them, for I had learned the futility of such intervention. The truths I carried were heavy, and they would not be heeded. They would learn in their own time the cost of survival, the price of command, and the hollow echo that lingers long after victory. My echo had ended. My voice would no longer shape the march of armies or the rhythm of drums. I had relinquished the compulsion to bend the world, to command it, to leave it scarred in my image. These words, now, are my final campaign. They are not written in the service of conquest, not to assert dominion over men, land, or time. They are written as an act of surrender, the laying down of a weapon I never truly carried in my hands, but always in my mind and in the pulse of my being. I record them as a testament, not to power, but to release. For the true immortality of a soldier is never in the refusal to die, nor in the survival of flesh, nor in the accumulation of medals, banners, and victories. It lies in memory, the living remembrance that refuses to rest, and memory, when venerated, when worshipped, becomes a ghost that lingers in every battlefield, in every trench, in every soldier who carries forward the illusion of heroism. My ghost, I realized, was no longer mine to command. It belonged to the continuum of war itself, the drumbeat that had once commanded armies, that had measured every maneuver, every charge, every tactical advance, faded slowly. I could hear it, still faintly, beneath the roar of wind and the hush of snow, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of my heartbeat. It was a distant echo, a memory of a rhythm that had governed men and machines alike, yet it held no authority over me. The snow continued to fall, indifferent to my thoughts, to the history I had authored, to the lives I had shaped and shattered. The world was cleansing itself, layer by layer, covering the remnants of war with a soft, unrelenting purity. Trenches, wrecked tanks, scattered rifles, and abandoned encampments vanished beneath the slow accumulation of frost. Even the ghosts of my past seemed to obey, their forms dissolving into the white calm as if the snow carried with it a quiet decree, rest now. All has ended, and at last I rested, not in the sense of sleep, for my mind remained alive with memory, reflection, and the endless ripple of cause and consequence. I rested in the sense of surrender, of relinquishing the claim I had made upon the world and upon myself. The wars that had once defined me would continue, carried forward by men who did not know my name, by generations who would never hear the echo of my voice. Yet in that surrender, I found a strange liberation. The weight of identity, of expectation, of command, fell away, leaving a man who was neither immortal nor invincible, but simply present. I moved through the manor slowly, my steps light on floors that had once felt heavy with history. I paused at the windows and watched the snow gather on the hills of H. Heidelberg, each flake a fleeting moment of quiet, a single note in the symphony of time that no longer demanded my participation. The uniform I once wore with pride lay folded, each medal a confession of memory, each ribbon a whisper of the past. I touched them briefly, not to honor myself, but to acknowledge that they, too, had served their purpose, to remind me of what had been, so that I could release it. Outside, life moved on without me. Convoys of young soldiers passed along frozen roads, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes bright with the illusion I had once carried. They did not need my guidance nor my warning. Their battles, their victories, their defeats would right themselves as mine had done. I watched, and for the first time, I understood the mercy of irrelevance. To no longer be central to the narrative of war was not to be defeated, it was to be freed. The drumbeat of command had ceased, and the world at last was silent around me. The snow thickened, muffling even memory itself. It fell over every scar, every grave, every echo of the wars I had known. It fell like absolution, concealing not only the physical remnants of conflict, but the psychological ones, the deep impressions left on the mind of a man who had believed himself eternal. And as it fell, I felt a lightness that had been impossible in life, a sense of quiet that was not the absence of thought, but the presence of acceptance. At last, I returned to the window, pen in hand. These words, these final confessions, would be my ultimate campaign. Not one of conquest, not one of triumph, not one that demanded obedience, fear, or loyalty. They were written in the service of understanding, of closure, of surrender. I would leave no orders behind, no echoes to command, no spectral armies to haunt the living. In my final act, I would allow memory to rest, and with it, the ghost of the soldier I had once been. The drumbeat was gone. The snow continued to fall, and finally, the general rested,